The Book of the American Pit Bull Terrier. Richard F. Stratton. Chapter 12. Bulldogs in the Courtroom. One useless man is called a disgrace. Two or more are called a law firm. John Adams. Sometime in December 1977, a man introduced himself to me as Ed Augustine. He had bought a pup from a guy named Tom Wagoner that I knew casually. He wanted to buy a copy of my book and, like so many that visit here, he wanted information on the dogs. I have mixed feelings about dealing with novices in the breed. On the one hand, I want to help them, especially if they are the type that I think would be an asset to the breed. On the other hand, they can be something of a bore to me since I meet so many of them and they pretty much ask the same old questions. I have, however, never turned one away. In this particular case I should have. He happened to be in the employment of the San Diego Humane Society and he was conducting an undercover investigation. One time Ed showed up with his wife. Actually, she was a member of the district attorney's staff. I was to learn later that both of them were wired and there was a backup unit parked a couple blocks away receiving their signals. One misstep here and I would have been off to the slammer. Well, Ed showed up at various and sundry times on a variety of pretexts. One time he wanted advice on treating his pup. He said Tom had given her a shot of combiotics and he wondered if I had anything that would help. In retrospect, this was a ludicrous action on his part, as he was deliberately trying to set me up for a charge of practicing veterinary medicine without a license. As a matter of fact, Wagoner was later charged with the offense because he took $1 from Augustine for the shot of combiotics that he administered. Ed was just spinning his wheels in my case, though, because I never take money for any veterinary services I might render. In this particular case I recommended a veterinarian that I considered quite competent. Without a doubt, they then proceeded to investigate him for complicity in dogfighting. Throughout several months Ed would call and come by for a variety of reasons. I didn't pay too much attention to him, as he was just one of many, so I don't recall a whole lot about the details of the visits. Ed, however, was recording every happening and quoting me directly on a number of occasions in the reports that he made after every visit. I do recall, however, that I showed him a Xerox copy of an advertisement that Howard Heinze had sent me. The ad was for an oil drilling tool called the Pit Bull Mud Mixer. Since the advertisement featured a picture of a pit bull and referred to the breed, it was of interest to American Pit Bull Terrier fanciers. Heinze had written on the back of the copy, "If I had my way, they'd have their picture on the dollar bill." Saying that he was a printer, Ed asked if he could take the copy and see if he could get additional copies made. In the middle of the week he called and said he had 15 copies of that ad for me. I was busy at the time and I had a lot of work to do, so I told him I would call him at a later date. As it turned out, there were several people coming over on Saturday. I thought this was a good time to have Ed over too, thus killing several birds with one stone. So I gave him a call and he arrived late after just about everyone else had gone. The only one still present was Jesse Boykin, who wanted to buy a dog. I don't normally sell dogs, but Jesse was interested in the same line of dogs as I was and had taken excellent care of a female that he had gotten from me earlier. In trying to decide between two different females, we were trying to get them to work the spring pole. One of them, Dolly, was not getting the idea, so I brought out Honey Bear, who was a real whiz on the spring pole. The idea was that Dolly would be excited by the sight of Honeybear working the spring pole and would be inspired to work it herself. For some reason Honeybear, who had been perfectly friendly to Dolly on other occasions, ignored the spring pole and scratched straight into Dolly. Well, I was surprised that Dolly would even fight, as she had shown no signs of aggression at all and she was just a young dog. But fight she did, and she had Honeybear by the ear and was really manhandling him. We separated the dogs immediately and returned them to their kennel runs. Tuesday evening, May 9, 1978, at about 7 o'clock, I had just settled down to some reading. There was a knock at the front door. When one of my sons answered, the man stated he had an arrest warrant for Richard and Stephanie Stratton. Thinking it was one of my friends trying to be fun New York, I went to the door and was startled to find several strangers on my doorstep with a bona fide arrest warrant. They also had a search warrant and Captain Verdon, head of the local Humane Society, entered with his entourage. Under his supervision a complete search was made of my premises. They even went through my boy's room with a fine-toothed comb. My 8 dogs were carted off in Humane Society trucks. Pictures were taken of them and their names were stamped on their collars. Then I remembered. Only a few days earlier Ed had asked for detailed specifications on kennels for pit bulls. At the time I did not realize that I was giving information on how to house my own dogs. In the meantime a crowd had gathered out front. The lights from the television cameras and a large number of police and Humane Society vehicles were drawing people from all over. The television people tried to interview my neighbors, but they refused to say anything bad about me, so none of that was aired. Captain Verdon, however, provided them with an interview, saying that this was the biggest dogfighting bust in 15 years. When one of the interviewers stated that the dogs were obviously well cared for, Captain Verdon responded that he didn't have much regard for people that lavished all this loving care on an animal only to put in a pit to die. "I don't call that humane," he concluded dramatically, "I call that rotten." There was no basis whatsoever for that remark. I had never matched any dogs and with the single exception of an accidental kennel fight, I had never had a dog killed fighting, and Verdon had no reason to believe that I had. Besides that, Verdon had told me that the television people had found their way to my house by monitoring their radio transmissions. Well, that was a lie, as I later found out from the television people that Verdon had called them. But that was only the beginning to a whole lot of lying. At the same time that our place was raided, Wagoner and Boykin were being subjected to the same thing. Poor Jesse had only one dog, his house dog, and they confiscated it. In my case, in addition to my dogs, treadmills, spring poles, breaking sticks, all kinds of correspondence, magazines and books were confiscated. Jesse had none of these things, so they confiscated among other things a broken badminton pole. While the television cameras came to my house and I received the brunt of the publicity, at least I was not subjected to the degrading treatment that Boykin and Wagoner received. They showed up at Jesse's place of employment and took him away in handcuffs. Wagoner was handcuffed and forced to lie face down while they carted off his dogs and searched his house. In retrospect, I am amazed at my calm while my family sat in unbelieving silence. Perhaps I, too, was in a state of shock. I had never been arrested before for anything, and I had just had my driver's license automatically extended because I had received no moving violation over 4 years' time. Whatever was back of all of this, I felt the best immediate course of action was to be cooperative, and I had faith that everything would right itself in the end. In the meantime, it hurt me to see dogs that had been raised from puppyhood on my place carted off. My wife was in tears and begged Verdun that we be allowed to see the dogs. Verdun assured her that she could visit them the next day. Another lie. It was 6 weeks before we were allowed to see our dogs, and that required a court order. The next day we surveyed the wreckage of our lives, or so it seemed at the time. The newspapers were running front-page headlines on the story. We were receiving crank phone calls and crank mail. In order to get the arrest and search warrants, Augustine had sworn out an affidavit saying that I had called him and invited him to a dogfight and that he had witnessed a fight on my property. The papers quoted from the affidavit and then filled in with general information about dogfighting that they apparently got from the Humane Society. One of the few bright spots in those dark days was the way our friends rallied to our support. I was concerned about the reaction of the other faculty members at school, but I need not have been. They were foursquare behind me, absolutely convinced that I would not be involved in anything wrong, and they all offered to testify for me if it came to that. It was truly heartwarming. I was especially thankful to my mother-in-law, Stella Slosky. It would have been easy for her to have been bitter. Here I had taken her daughter who had been reared in the lap of luxury, and not only had I failed to provide her with the things to which she had become accustomed, but I had also gotten her thrown in jail. She and my father-in-law Sam, however, were completely supportive. They helped us out in so many ways that I don't think I ever did thank them properly, until now. After these events transpired, it was time to start looking for an attorney. I had never needed one before in my life, so I had no idea what criteria to utilize in selecting one. Several of my friends are attorneys, but they live out of state. One of them suggested that I consult with several, then go with the one with whom I felt most comfortable. After hearing our story, one attorney shook his head. According to him, the Humane Society was a tough opponent to go up against in court. They always had the sympathy of the jury and had a built-in aura of respectability. A typical Humane Society case, according to this attorney, went along these lines. An old woman outlives all her friends and has few relatives and little purpose in life. She feeds and adopts a stray cat and then another. The process continues until she has an abundance of adopted cats. Eventually, as she gets older, she is less able to care for her charges. She has barely enough food and can't afford medical bills. A few of the cats develop skin problems and all of them are a trifle underweight, but she is too soft-hearted and sentimental to have the cats destroyed. So she gets busted by the Humane Society, which apparently does not concern itself with the cats running wild that are underfed and have skin problems. This particular attorney, incidentally, considered the Humane Society a blight on society in the sense that it tended to elevate animal concerns way above human considerations. One of the things I was unprepared for was the competition among lawyers. We consulted several because we felt that we wanted the very best, but we didn't expect them to call back in the evening like car salesmen. After about 2 weeks we settled upon Charlie Herod as our attorney. Charlie was bright and engaging, and he was the nephew of world-famous attorney Vincent Hallinan. We liked all the attorneys with whom we consulted, but we were especially impressed with Charlie's candor. In the meantime, poor Jesse had to get a loan on his house to afford an attorney, and not a very good attorney at that. At least we didn't think so. His opinion was that we would have no chance in a trial because it would be our word against the law enforcement officer, in our area, humane agents are deputized, and juries rarely believe defendants in such cases. His approach was to try to get a deal. The deal he negotiated was a reduction to a misdemeanor for Jesse if he would testify against me. This Jesse refused to do, so he decided to get another attorney. He secured the services of Gordon Freville, Charlie's partner. One of the things an attorney does is try to negotiate a deal through plea bargaining. Forget about the principle of not being guilty, we were told. If the case went to trial, there was always the chance of a conviction, guilty or not. An attorney's job is to minimize the amount of possible harm to his client. As it turned out, however, the only deal they would negotiate involved my bringing evidence against Larry McCaw. Verdon in his talk to the news media had promised more arrests, and although he didn't name anyone, he made reference to a prominent businessman, a college professor and a doctor that were involved in this ring. I knew the people he was talking about, and now it became clear that I was supposed to buy my way out of trouble by turning state's evidence against these people. Specifically, they were after McCaw. Even if I had been inclined to go along with this, and I was not, Charlie wouldn't have let me. He was not the type of attorney that believed in getting his client off by selling out someone else. Stephanie and I dreaded the trauma of a trial, but we girded ourselves for the inevitable. In the long run, we preferred complete absolution of guilt anyway. An important part of trial is the selection of a jury. The defense is trying to get people that will be sympathetic, and the prosecution is trying to get rid of them. So even before the trial begins, the adversary system is in full effect and the battle is joined. Charlie and Gordon wanted our reactions in the selection of a jury, for a gut reaction seemed to be even more important than many years of experience with various juries. There were only two people about whom there was any disagreement. One was the wife of a police officer. Charlie definitely wanted to bump her, as he felt she would be prejudiced in favor of any badge-toting witness, even a Humane Society officer. I, however, was the son of a police officer. In fact, my father had been chief of the campus police at the University of Colorado, and I was not inclined to view the police mentality as cynically as was Charlie. Besides, we would have two police officers testifying for our side. In addition, the juror in question had testified that she would not give more weight to a police officer's testimony, and in so saying she laughed and rolled her eyes as though to emphasize that she knew they were no more truthful than anyone else. The other juror in question was a fundamentalist minister. Charlie wanted to bump him on the basis of past experience with fundamentalist-type ministers. In his experience, they were too doctrinaire and judgmental and tended to be prosecution-oriented, but I liked him and thought he would be okay. The jury was selected in 2 days and the prosecution began its case on the third day. The case very simply was testimony by Augustine, who alleged that the accidental fight in my backyard had been purposeful. In addition, my treadmill, spring pole, breaking sticks and books were put into evidence. Charlie wasted little time in cross-examination of Augustine, and the prosecution rested its case after testimony of the Humane Society veterinarian. While the prosecution only had 3 witnesses, Augustine, the agent who executed the search warrant, and the veterinarian, the defense compensated with a plethora of witnesses. I led off. Under questioning by Charlie, I denied the fight in my backyard had been purposeful, and I explained that the purpose of the spring pole was for the enjoyment of the dogs. Then came a variety of witnesses. John Gray from the Los Angeles Police Department testified that he kept pit bulls and that breaking sticks were a necessity. He also testified that my reputation among dog people was that I did not fight dogs. Pretty much the same thing was testified to by Al Stone, a retired police officer and now an attorney. Tom Stoneburner and Brad Powell of the Golden State Pit Bull Club also testified along similar lines. All of these people made outstanding witnesses, but one of the most outstanding was Susie Stewart, an admitted out-of-state dog fighter. My attorney claimed she was the best witness he had ever had in all his years of law practice. Beautiful, radiant and articulate, Susie testified that she and her husband had agreed to sell me an outstanding dog named Dillinger. She explained that no one else would ever have gotten the dog because they would have been tempted to match him, and he was too valuable to utilize for anything other than as a stud dog. Her appearance was so angelic and she was so articulate that she tended to dispel the dog fighter stereotype. And I'll never forget Harriet, who testified to my reputation. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor posed a question for her: if I told you that a Humane Society officer had witnessed Mr. Stratton fight 2 dogs, would that change your opinion of him? I'm under oath, said Harriet after a thoughtful pause. And I have to tell the truth. She gave another thoughtful pause and the prosecutor waited with a pleased look on his face. Then she added, I would have to cast serious doubt as to the reliability of that officer. At times the trial seemed downright unreal. The prosecution had brought in all my dogs for the jury to view, and he took the incredible position that since my dogs wanted to fight, I had trained them to be that way. Augustine's testimony implied that you had to train your dogs to fight. He said the one he bought from Wagoner showed no inclination to fight. Of course, it was still basically a pup. Well, we brought in someone unimpeachable to counter that argument in the personage of Senator Mills. President pro tem of the state Senate, Senator Mills, who had owned 4 pit bulls, testified that they did not have to be trained to have the fighting urge. He also said some nice things about the American Pit Bull Terrier which warmed my heart. One of the main things he stressed was the breed's good disposition and unusual tolerance of the maulings of small children. The only drawback about his testimony was that it drew further media attention to the trial. After all the witnesses came the closing arguments. The prosecutor, ostensibly because the burden of proof is on him, gets to speak twice. To my amazement, the prosecutor did not even try to allege that I ever matched a dog. All that he tried to say was that I had rolled my dogs. This brought to mind that one of the authors of the bill had reassured a group of people that the law had been deliberately worded so that it was aimed only at people that were matching dogs. Now here was some hard-headed prosecutor trying to make every aspect of fighting dogs, in his own words, a felony. Again, this was dangerously close to outlawing the breed. Then came the long wait after the case went to the jury. It was a long wait too. For several days we waited. When the jury finally came in, it was to report that they were hopelessly deadlocked on Stephanie and me. However, they did acquit Jess. As we learned later, the very people that I was adamant about leaving on the jury, the fundamentalist minister and the policeman's wife, were the ones that held out for conviction. So much for my intuition regarding jurors. The trial had lasted 2 weeks. It had been long and expensive for the state, and since the jury had been hung in favor of acquittal, conventional wisdom held that the case would be dismissed. A telephone call from Charlie brought bad news. We were going back to trial. Chapter 13. triumph and tragedy. Wise men argue causes, and fools decide them. Anarchists. Before we went to trial the first time, we had been told that the percentages are in favor of the prosecution. Now we were informed that the prosecution wins an even higher percentage of retrials. If they aren't sure they are going to win, they don't take the case back. Ironically, we had drawn a bulldog of a prosecutor and he was scratching right back into us. With the percentages weighed in favor of the prosecution, we decided to take on an additional attorney. We had seen Matt Lees at work at a preliminary hearing and we were impressed by him. Our confidence had not been shaken in Charlie, far from it, but we were determined to win, redeem our reputations and save the lives of our dogs. From what I've said before, the reader may have gathered that I have lost some of my former respect for lawyers and judges generally. The reader would be right. I never realized before what a collection of drunks comprised the law profession. Sober as a judge, lost considerable impact when I watched many of them stagger out of the bar called the Gavel, across from the courthouse. However, my respect for certain individual jurists was tremendous. I had considerable admiration for our first judge, but I was to gain even greater admiration for the judge that presided over the second trial. His name was Norbert Ehrenfround and he was unbelievably diligent in his duties. He kept a tight rein on the prosecution and the defense, while being fair to both. In addition, he was considerate and compassionate. One incident will illustrate the compassion of the judge. During the course of the trial, we maintained our habit of visiting our dogs weekly. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it was 6 weeks before we were able to begin seeing our dogs, and it took a court order for that. In fairness to the Humane Society, they had what they thought was a good reason for denying us access. In 2 previous cases where pit dogs had been confiscated in the state, the dogs were broken out of the kennels. With these facts in mind, 2 armed deputies from the sheriff's office were assigned to guard the premises around the clock. I'll never forget our shock at the sight of our dogs on our very first visit. 3 of them were so skinny that you could all but see through them. To compensate for that, 3 others were so obese they could hardly walk. I was absolutely astounded that the dogs would be allowed to get into such a condition. Couldn't these people see? Both of us were quite upset over the condition of our dogs. However, Humane Society officials were very cooperative in acceding to our requests on how the dogs were fed. They were quite willing to give our dogs special treatment, probably because they thought we would end up paying for it anyway. A change in attitude occurred after the first trial. Even after his acquittal, Jess had to obtain a court order for the release of his dog. To Jesse's amazement, the prosecutor asked that the Humane Society be reimbursed for boarding Boykin's dog. The judge, of course, would have none of that, saying that making an acquitted person pay for that would be a little harsh, like making an innocent man have to pay room and board for the time he had spent in jail. For whatever reason, after the first trial things started to go downhill again. During the final week of the second trial, we were dismayed to find one of our dogs, Star, so weak she could hardly walk. Sergeant Crawford, who was overseeing our visit, agreed that the dog was in bad shape and referred her case to the veterinarian that tended the dogs at the Humane Society. We weren't satisfied with her progress, and our attorney asked the judge that this one dog be released to our custody for personalized attention. As always, the prosecutor saw some dark plot in this and nearly had a hemorrhage that something might go our way. Here is my point. It would have been easy for the judge to have shrugged the whole thing off. After all, the dog was under the care of the veterinarian and in the custody of the Humane Society which, to give them their just due, has developed an apparently unassailable reputation. However, this judge convened the court, without the jury, at the Humane Society kennels and had their veterinarian explain the dog's condition. He then ordered that the dog be sent to an independent veterinarian for a blood scan and recommendations. The point of all this is that the compassion, efficiency and plain human decency of certain jurists, like Judge Aaron Freund, and even of some of the lawyers, commanded my admiration intended to offset my initial negative impression of the entire judicial system. The second trial went pretty much like the first except that it lasted longer. For some reason the prosecutor took an entire week to select a jury. Perhaps he felt it was the jury's fault that he lost the first time. Another major change was that not only did the prosecutor not bring the dogs in, but he also fought tooth and nail against our request to have them brought in. Obviously he realized that the charm of these dogs had had some sort of effect on the previous jury. We were allowed to bring in only one dog, Honey Bear, and that was because there had been considerable testimony about that specific dog introduced by the prosecutor. He was my only scarred dog, but we had accounted for the scars. I was on the stand when Honey Bear was brought in. As before I could tell that the charm of the dog was having an effect. Matt showed Honey Bear to the jury and demonstrated his friendliness toward humans, but the prosecutor demanded to know what would happen if another dog were present. I answered honestly, he would attack with abandon. But there would be no hatred in it, just a joyous love of battle. Well, anyway, the case finally went to the jury. They quickly came back with a not guilty verdict and our long nightmare was finally over. Our dogs had been in custody since May 9th, and we were acquitted on December 22nd. Some of our friends felt that we should force the Humane Society to deliver our dogs to us since the law specifically provided for that. In the glow of victory, however, I had no desire to rub the Society's nose in what they had done. There were occasions on which Society personnel had been very considerate of us and we had actually grown to like some of them. In any case, I held no hatred for the Humane Society, but I still despised that stupid law. At the beginning of the ordeal when we were shopping for an attorney, several of them looked the law up and shook their heads. Here is how it reads. Penal Code 597.5 Dog fights training, conducting, attending. A. Any person who does any of the following is guilty of a felony and is punishable by imprisonment in a state prison not to exceed 1 year and 1 day, or by imprisonment in a county jail not to exceed 1 year, or by a fine not to exceed $50,000, or by both such fine and imprisonment. 1. Owns, possesses, keeps, or trains any dog, with the intent that such dog shall be engaged in an exhibition of fighting with another dog. 2. For amusement or gain, causes any dog to fight with another dog, or causes any dogs to injure each other. 3. Permits any act in violation of paragraph 1, or 2, to be done on any premises under his charge or control, or aids or abets any such act. B. Any person who is knowingly present as a spectator, at any place, building, or tenement where preparations are being made for an exhibition of the fighting of dogs, with the intent to be present at such preparations, or is knowingly present at such exhibition or at any other fighting or injuring as described in paragraph 2 of subdivision A, with the intent to be present at such exhibition, fighting or injuring is guilty of a misdemeanor. A catch-all law is how one attorney described it. It really gives broad authority to the loonies, said another. My main objection to it all along, of course, was that innocent owners of the American Pit Bull Terrier might be harassed or arrested. Little did I ever think, though, that I would end up being the victim of it. I was so busy worrying about others that I forgot to cover my own gluteus maximus. Shortly after my trial, I was asked by some dog men in Arizona to speak to the State Assembly Committee there, as they, too, were considering a law worded nearly identical to the abomination that had been passed in California. This whole thing had been instigated by Augustine, who testified before an assembly committee there to the effect, apparently, that California had a very fine law that was driving all the dog fighters out of California and over to Arizona. The obvious implication was that Arizona needed a similar law. I testified that, 1. Pit dog men were not leaving California en masse, 2. There were undoubtedly more fights held in California than in Arizona, and, 3. Innocent people could be harassed. I also gave an account of my recent experience. After hearing all this, all one legislator could think to ask was, "Do you presently live in Arizona, Mr. Stratton?" When I said that I didn't, he wanted to know why I was over there poking my nose in Arizona's affairs. It didn't matter, apparently, that Augustine also was from out of state. When I replied that I was concerned about the breed and its owners regardless of location, he asked, "Well, are you going to go to all the other states to testify, too, if they want to pass a law?" This turkey was simply being obnoxious. There was no point to his questions. "Senator," I replied, "it is my fervent hope that any other state legislators will have the sagacity not even to consider such egregious legislation." I knew from the start that there was no stopping the steamroller. There were several television crews present, and with all the media coverage there was just no way that those political animals were going to fail to pass that legislation and be known as a pro-dog fighter. A couple of the legislators spoke apologetically to me in private afterwards. One said she would try to have the bill killed in the assembly. Another vowed to take the teeth out of it. It, however, never happened, and I never thought it would. Another person speaking apologetically to me was the SPCA director. He told me that he knew the inside story on my case, and he was well aware of what a miscarriage of justice it was that I was even charged in the first place. "Well, then," I asked, "why did you support the very legislation that made it all possible?" "Well, we just felt we had to put an end to all this dogfighting." At that point I gave up. I had just finished testifying as to the ineffectiveness of the law in California. During the course of the hearing, these legislators, too, made assurances that this law would not be used against someone who merely game tested his stock. Now, where did I hear that before? Meanwhile, the Wagoner trial had ended with a conviction. Much to the dismay of the prosecutor at sentencing, the judge reduced Wagoner's conviction to a misdemeanor and gave him a suspended sentence. The prosecutor protested that such leniency would not provide a deterrent for other dog fighters. The judge dismissed that idea contemptuously, saying that they were never going to get dogfighting stopped. Well, then, the prosecutor wanted Wagoner to pay the board bill for his dogs, a mere $18,000. This, too, the judge refused to grant, saying that it was not Wagoner's idea that the dogs be kept there. In fact, he had asked for their release, and the prosecution insisted that they were evidence. Then, obviously feeling the sting of defeat, the prosecution asked for a court order to destroy the dogs. This the judge did grant, and I am told that both Augustine and the prosecutor smiled for the first time that day. These agents of the Humane Society were now showing their true colors. Matt Lees was the defense attorney for Wagoner 2, and he beseeched the judge for a stay on the order to destroy the dogs. Saying that he did not want to destroy the dogs, the judge granted the stay. The judge had asked for an alternative, so Matt went to work. He got a dog trainer to evaluate the dogs' suitability as pets. The prosecutor then insisted that they be allowed to send their trainer too. Their representative had been a former member of the board of directors for the Humane Society, and his wife was still on the board, so you can imagine his objectivity. It turned out that the defense advised adoption and the prosecution's witness advised that they all be destroyed. The judge finally caved in and ordered the destruction of the dogs. This was in the face of the fact that Matt had obtained 100 names of people who would not only give the dogs a home but would submit to periodic inspection by the Humane Society. The prosecution, however, had come in armed with letters from other humane societies, saying that pit bulls have been involved in attacks on people. I can't think of any breed that hasn't. 3 Pekingese were reported to have killed a baby a few years back. Naturally, some breeds are more likely to attack than others, but neither the pit bull nor the staff appear on the list of breeds that are problem biters. The statement that pit bulls were not suitable pets is not even worthy of comment. The whole affair was capped off by the unseemly haste with which the dogs were destroyed. By the time Matt got word of the order, the dogs were already dead and the press was asking for a statement. They got one. Matt appeared on television that night exuding cold fury. You see, Matt had been in to visit the dogs and he knew that there was not one there that was not suitable for adoption. This whole thing was a simple vendetta by the Humane Society. Even the judge had commented about the grudge that the Humane Society seemed to have against these dogs. The ludicrous thing was that many of the dogs had been born and raised right there in the Humane Society kennels, and the Humane Society's haste in destroying the dogs completely circumvented the appeal that, by law, Matt had the right to file within 48 hours of the time the order was issued. Up to this particular point in time, I had always viewed the Humane Society as a basically good organization filled with well-meaning people. Their intentions were good, but they were just a little misguided about dogfighting. However, after all those dogs were killed for no reason other than the appeasement of the Humane Society, my attitude changed. How could they have respect for such petty, narrow-minded and vindictive people? I didn't blame the judge because, after all, he didn't know any better. The Humane Society did, however, and I don't think the stink of what they did should ever be allowed to escape them. But for them, 18 dogs and puppies could be alive right now and living in good homes. I guess I was not the only one that was disgusted. A few months later, the local animal control asked that their names be taken off the membership list because of certain recent events. All along, spokesmen for the Humane Society had maintained that they were not against the breed, in fact they admired the dogs. It was the people who misused them that they were after. In the final analysis, however, the dogs were their victims. At the present time, a petition has been initiated by parties having no connection with pit bulldogs to ask that the grand jury investigate certain incidents, including the destruction of the dogs.